Academic publishing is one of the most profitable businesses on the planet, and the scientific community, which this industry exists to serve, are generally not happy with it. There's loads of rage-filled content online, usually saying something like, academics write these articles, they don't get paid for it, they can't even access it. But then, after this content gets put up, we all just kind of move on. Nothing ever seems to stick. Things just go back to the way they were. The purpose of this video is not to give academic publishing an intellectual spanking, denouncing loudly all that is wrong with it, because frankly, there's been enough of that. Nothing ever seems to stick. Instead, I would like to ask a different question. Why is academic publishing the way that it is? And why is it so resistant to change? Articles critiquing a lack of transparency in peer review are themselves peer-reviewed behind closed doors. The examination of the concentration of power in the hands of just a few companies in academic publishing is examined within journals that are owned by those same companies. The publishing system is so large, so complex, and so necessary that it feels really difficult to be able to pull it apart and look at all the little pieces that make it up. And it feels even harder to be able to imagine an alternative. But I think that once we understand how we got to this point and examine the normal publishing processes and traditions and practices a little closer, we can then have a constructive discussion about how we might do things differently. Part 1. To honor scholarship. Scholarly publishing has existed for 361 years, and for the vast majority of the time, it was a terribly unprofitable business. It was an incredibly expensive activity performed in service to scholarship at a financial loss by learned societies. And the reason why it was so expensive was because journals had to be printed on physical paper. The cost of paper, printing, binding, typesetting, artwork, distribution, all of that stuff made journals, the production of journals, very, very expensive, almost prohibitive. Partly due to a sense of scholarly duty and also partly because the costs were so high. Authors in the 17th century, which is when modern publishing kind of begins to emerge, did not submit their work to journals. They gifted it. And by printing this work, the society would then redistribute this gift back to its wider membership. Learned societies across Europe also frequently gifted each other copies of their journals in the hope that they might one day receive a similar gift. You see, knowledge creation through publishing was a necessary but heavy burden to bear, and scholars gladly donated their time and their energy to facilitate it. They served as contributors, editors, and peer reviewers solely to support knowledge creation through publishing and basically to uphold high-quality scholarship. And this is where we get this tradition of publishing running on a gift economy. This is why authors, editors, and reviewers are not paid, even today. From the 19th century onwards, science started to become a profession. The gentlemen scientists of these early learned societies were gradually replaced by professional academics who conducted their work as a full-time job. And how might you distinguish between a gentleman scientist who does research as a hobby and a professional academic who does it as a vocation? You would use their publication records. Expertise and reputation were linked to your publishing record instead of to your social status. And obviously this linking of one's professional standing to a publication record meant that more publications were produced, which also meant that these societies had to give more and more resources to printing costs and publishing journals in general. By the time we get to the mid-20th century, shortages of manpower and materials caused by World War I, the interwar period, and World War II have basically led to another surge in printing costs, to the point where printing was now becoming completely unaffordable. Societies could not afford to continue publishing their journals. So in an attempt to break even, these learned societies stopped gifting their journals to institutions like universities and other learned societies as they had been doing for the last couple hundred years. They began to sell them. And this is more or less how we got to publishing as we recognize it today. Academic labor is donated, journals are bought and sold, and one's reputation is linked to a publication record. Part 2. Printing money. The end of World War II was a significant event for science. Governments had seen how technological and scientific advancement was key to national security and prosperity. Government support for scientific research became the norm, which led to an increase in published papers and also larger budgets for libraries who would of course buy the journals that would publish these papers. And all of this extra money sloshing around meant that for the first time in history, academic publishing could turn a profit. There was enough money floating around that journals could charge higher prices and people could afford to buy them. And also there was a larger community of scientists who wanted to buy these journals and who wanted to be published in these journals. This drew the attention of commercial publishers who saw a lucrative opportunity. At the start, the presence of commercial publishers was not entirely a bad thing. They used their profits to launch more journals, which could serve more specific communities of researchers, and they were also more international in their focus. Although their activities were motivated by profit, they were able to meet the needs of a growing global scientific community. In contrast, learned societies tended to focus on more local scholarly communities and directed any profits they had from publishing towards fellowships and grants, as opposed to expanding their publishing operations. For most of the 1950s and the 1960s, things were going smoothly. Learned society publishers and commercial publishers were able to exist more or less in relative harmony. More papers were being published every year, but more journals were being launched every year, so they could soak up all these papers. And more than that, library budgets would rise every year, so they could always afford to buy all the journals. But peaceful coexistence would not survive the economic crisis of the next 20 years, known as the Great Inflation. During this period, not-for-profit society publishing essentially collapsed. When the economic crises meant that government support for science was scaled back, publishers suddenly faced a problem. Libraries had less money to buy all their journals. Now, under normal market conditions, the reduced purchasing power of libraries should have meant that journal prices would have come down. But academic publishing is not a normal market. Academic literature is inherently monopolistic. You can never buy the same article from two different publishers. That's the whole point of an academic article. It's meant to be unique, and it's meant to be one of a kind. With no risk of competition, whoever owns a journal that can attract high-quality papers can charge whatever price they want to, because one high-quality paper cannot be reproduced by another journal at a lower price. This makes prestigious journals, which everybody agrees are irreplaceable, especially powerful. So what commercial publishers did was raise the prices of their most prestigious journals. And what this did was it effectively crippled library budgets. They felt that they had to buy these most prestigious journals. And what that meant was there was less money floating around for smaller journals, many of whom were owned by learned societies. And when these learned societies went bankrupt because nobody was buying their journals, these big commercial publishers swooped in and bought them. The same companies that had driven them out of business acquired them once they went bankrupt. This is why over half of all scholarly output today is controlled by just 5 companies. The consolidation of the publishing market continued into the 1990s, alongside advances in digital technology that meant that publishing could now be done online. Initially, the ease of sharing files online threatened to undo this very lucrative business model that these commercial publishers were enjoying. Therefore, commercial publishers would lobby extensively to change copyright law that would prevent the free sharing of scholarly knowledge under their control, which was, of course, pretty much all of it. This is how the paywalled article that we're all familiar with came to be. This is also why commercial publishers are legally allowed to license content they did not pay to create, edit, or review to AI companies for millions of dollars. But anyway, going back to the 1990s, the digitization of research and how easy it was to share files online, plus the realization that commercial publishers had virtually all of the last 100 years worth of research under copyright, led to the open access movement. But it was too late. The damage was done. I personally don't think that open access has made profiteering from academic research any harder. These companies have easily survived the transition to open access, which doesn't allow them to hold copyright over the articles. All they did was basically shift from a journal-based economy, where you sell journals, to an article-based economy, where people have to pay for the articles. But something else has happened which nobody seems to have realized. As research has become digital, the cost of printing has come down to basically zero. If you remember, right, the transformation of publishing from an act of care and stewardship for knowledge into a commercial venture was driven by the high cost of printing. But nowadays, I don't know how many of you have ever engaged with a physical printed journal. I never have. Never. Not once. Not even when I did my undergraduate degree like 12 years ago. It was always online. That limiting factor, the cost of printing, paper, typesetting, artwork, binding, all of that stuff doesn't exist anymore. Of course, new technologies do bring their own expenses, like maintaining web domains and storage and servers and all that stuff. But compared to the historically heavy burden of printing, it's nothing. It's minuscule. This table shows the production cost of the Royal Society's publishing operations in 1936 and 1986. And of course, around the late 80s, early 90s is when digitization really starts to become, a thing. In 1936, printing costs like paper, binding, and artwork accounted to almost 90% of the journal's operations. In 1986, that had come down to about 61%. How much do you think Elsevier spends on printing, paper, artwork, and binding in 2026? Not that much, I would say. If publishing had followed normal market dynamics, which as we've seen, it does not, then the falling cost of producing articles, the falling cost in printing, should have resulted in lower journal prices. But that has not happened. Okay, journal prices have gone up, higher than inflation, basically, ever since they became a commercial venture. So if publishers don't spend that much money on printing and paper and binding, what do they spend it on? The answer, as you can see in the table, is staff. Publishing companies basically spend their money on people like me. When I dropped out of my PhD, I worked in open access publishing for 2.5 years. Part 3, for the few, not the many. Leaving my PhD left me with complicated feelings. I didn't want to continue in academia anymore, but I also didn't want to leave research and scholarship behind entirely either. So when I was offered a job to work in open access publishing, I was delighted, I was thrilled. I thought that this was a way which I could still be involved in research, in scholarship, even if I was no longer an active researcher. On the day I started my job, my salary was 86% higher than the stipend a UK PhD student could expect to receive. Over the next 2.5 years, as my salary increased, I would eventually be paid more than the going rate for a junior postdoc in the UK, and I didn't even have a PhD. Virtually all publishers employ people today whose role is not strictly academic or essential to a journal's function. I'm talking about sales reps, machine learning engineers, branding, design, PR, social media managers. All of these roles are professional, well-paid jobs. On my first day in my job in open access publishing, my manager described my role to me as essentially sales, man. You could not have understood how disappointed I was to be hearing that. My job included analyzing the number of submissions the journal was receiving to see if they were growing fast enough compared to previous years. I developed action plans to boost journal revenues. I sat in meetings with my colleagues and discussed the implications of tightening journal quality controls on revenue. Meanwhile, the labor that really kept the journal that I worked for running, the work done by the editors, the reviewers, and the authors, was voluntary and unpaid. And how strange, I thought, seeing as how it's really their labor that this journal cannot do without. I was trained to use the existing pressures of academic life for the benefit of this journal that I worked for. I coaxed, I nudged, I persuaded academics to donate time they did not have to a company that did not care in order to fatten already very healthy profit margins. You see, the publishing industry continues to draw its vitality from the scholarly community in the same way that early learned societies did from their gentleman scientists 350 years ago. But things have changed. Publishing is no longer a loss-making operation, and scientists are not wealthy gentlemen anymore. And while the cost of printing has basically disappeared, the cost of staffing has just shot up. Commercial publishers today spend an absurd amount of their revenue on staff whose main job is to increase the profits of the companies that they work for. And if we really want a different publishing industry, that is where we need to focus our attention. Over the last 75 years that publishing has been run as a for-profit business, we've all collectively lost sight of the reason why these companies exist. They exist solely to aid the scholarly community in the creation of knowledge. And you know what else? These commercial publishers, even though they don't admit it, depend entirely on the goodwill of academics who basically prop these companies up with their time and their labor. In 2020, it was estimated that researchers from just 3 countries, the UK, the USA, and China, donated over $2.5 billion to for-profit companies just through their activities conducting peer review. Just that. Not authors, not editors, just peer reviewers. If I wanted to be really harsh, I would say that commercial publishers are exploiting academics and universities. And you know what? Why don't we see it that way? Why haven't we noticed this? It's because when we regulate the conduct of scholars or scholarly institutions, we only pay attention to the academics themselves and the universities. We don't pay a single shred of our attention towards the publishers, but they are such an integral part of the scholarly ecosystem, but they don't conduct themselves in a scholarly manner. At the start of the video, I asked, why is publishing so resistant to change? And as much as it's going to suck to say it, it's the salaried employees who work for commercial publishers who are themselves a massive obstacle to change. To reform knowledge creation through publishing is to put their jobs at risk. It is a lot to ask of them. If we say, you know what, publishers spend too much money on professional roles and they need to reduce their staff counts, that means people will lose their jobs. It's a lot to ask of those people. Ultimately, the rising profit margins of the publishing industry are beneficial to its employees, who can expect at least some of those profits to be given out in their salary increases and their bonuses. When I started my job, I did have a bonus based on performance, and I was paid it for 2 years. And to be truthful, to be really honest, I can only bring myself to say these words because I don't work in publishing anymore. It would be absolutely insane for me to be saying this if I was still a salaried employee at one of these companies. It is difficult to get a man to understand something where his salary depends on his not understanding it. Part 4. Scholar-led knowledge creation. When I started the research for this essay, I confess, I did not expect to be able to offer a compelling alternative to our current system. But as I've been tracing the history of scholarly publishing, I now think there is a way forward where we can move from being publisher-led to scholar-led. If you think about it, there is no minimum essential work that a journal needs to be, functioning, which cannot be performed by scholars themselves. Commercial publishers spend far too much money on non-academic staff whose role is not to facilitate knowledge creation, it's to increase profits. Scholars sustain this excess of staff by donating their time and their labor on top of performing their regular duties at their normal jobs, in universities. To me, the problem is pretty clear. Journals could charge lower prices for their articles, and scholars could be compensated for the work they do if there were less full-time, non-academic staff employed by commercial publishers. It doesn't seem like gold open access is going away anytime soon, and in this article-based economy that open access has now introduced, it would be possible to divide the APC among all the scholars whose work went into producing that article, especially the editors and the reviewers. Personally, I don't think that we should be paying authors. I really don't. I think that there are already more papers being published, many of them of questionable quality than we need, and I fear that if we were to actually incentivize the authoring of even more articles, it would just lead to just a wave of AI slop, which we just could not control. So I'm not in favor of paying authors, but definitely the editors and the reviewers. If individual publishers were not so large, then their staff counts could be reduced further still. Small operations publishing a handful of journals don't need global heads of HR, portfolio managers, legal and IP, and all that stuff. You don't need all of the administrative roles if you keep the operation small. Of course, some administrative support is required, but I think theoretically a small operation could compensate all the editors and the reviewers who do the scholarly work, and a handful of administrators, 1 or 2, who just do the day-to-day paperwork in the background. A new version of the not-for-profit society model, which could not survive the 70s and the 80s, could be reborn in our digital, article-based publishing economy today. Journals run in this way could still have an impact factor. They could still have the prestige, the reputation, they could still have the editorial processes that we've come to expect a journal to have. The only thing that would change is who gets paid for their labor and how many full-time staff publishing can support. In this way, the moral courage for change doesn't rest upon the scholarly community as it so often does. It rests on the commercial publishers. And perhaps, dare I dream, the proliferation of this kind of model could result in a shift from a knowledge economy to a knowledge ecology, which I talked about at the end of my Scholar Manifesto video. Discussions around academic publishing don't really interest people at the early stages of their career, because when you're a young researcher, the academic publishing industry exists to serve you and your ambitions in building a CV that will be impressive enough to get you hired to a full-time academic position. It's only later on, when you actually start climbing the steps of the ivory tower, that you realize the demands that will be placed on you. You see, the experienced academics are the ones who do the reviewing and the editing. They are the ones who donate time and labor to support this industry, and I know because it was my job to get them to make that donation. There is something Faustian about the way that a young researcher makes a pact with the publishing industry. Dr. Faustus sold his soul to the devil in exchange for 24 years of power, only to realize the extent of what he had agreed to when his time is up, when the devil comes to collect the debt. In the same way, the young scholar will only realize the harsh demands placed upon them in exchange for the initial rewards long after the deal is done. If you're an early career researcher watching this, then in 10 to 15 years' time, you probably will be senior enough to sit on the editorial board of journals. Your time will be in demand to review papers, to edit papers, to uphold high standards of scholarship. And I wonder, will you be content to donate your time and your labor to subsidize a job like a revenue acceleration manager? This is why the nature of the publishing industry should interest you. It is part of your inheritance. It will shape how you create knowledge. It will shape your career. It may feel distant now, in the golden years of your youth, but there may well come a time when you're unhappy with the terms of the deal that you signed with this industry. As usual, this essay was published in The Scholarly Letter, a weekly newsletter that I co-edit about the meaning of scholarship and the deeper purpose of intellectual work. I've done my best to transform it into a video essay, but I guarantee it's better if you read it. I've put a link to this essay in the description.